Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, everyone. It's really cool to be here and see you all, and this is my first time in Chautauqua, and I'm thrilled to be here. It's been a wonderful week. Well, today I wanted to dive into a topic that sits at the intersection of history, power, and personal freedom, one that continues to shape our lives in visible and invisible ways. It's a conversation that demands our attention, our curiosity, our courage, and perhaps just a little bit of rebellion. I'm a filmmaker, storyteller, advocate, and a mother of two, and it is because of that last role that I am personally invested in the fight for bodily autonomy. Over the next 45 minutes or so, 45 minutes-ish, hopefully I'll make it on time, I want to explore the idea of bodily autonomy, not just through theory or statistics, but through stories. Stories from my work in media and advocacy that have lit a fire in me, even when the fight for reproductive freedom feels relentless, as it does right now. In a post-Roe America, where the personal is political and the political is deeply personal, these stories remind me of why we must keep going and what a better future could look like. When we talk about abortion in America, we're not just talking about healthcare. We're talking about centuries of political power struggles, racial injustice, class warfare, and the ongoing fight over who gets to control our bodies, our identities, and our freedoms. Since the country's founding, abortion has been weaponized as a tool of control, and in 2025, what is clear is that the status quo that we have been relying on to win back our rights isn't working. The current playbook has offered us only the illusion of freedom. So what we need now is not a patch on a broken system, but a completely new strategy, one that refuses to build on crumbling foundations propped up by politics, law, religion, and capitalism. We're at a point where we have no choice but to cause what the late, great John Lewis called good trouble. That was his life's mission, and it must be ours too, I'm going to suggest. I'm inspired and honoured to share stories of ordinary people who have stared down powerful systems and said, "Not on our watch." These are the stories of courage, resistance, hope, and rebellion. Losing Roe v. Wade wasn't just about abortion. It was about freedom in every sense of the word. The freedom to control our bodies, our futures, and our lives. This moment is bigger than a court decision. It forces us to confront a deeper and more urgent question. Who gets to control our freedom, and who decides where it comes from? Now, the easy answer might be the Supreme Court. After all, they've been the ones to hand down landmark decisions on birth control, abortion, interracial marriage, same-sex marriage, the list goes on. But if they had the power to give those freedoms, that means they've also had the power to take them away. Let's start with Roe v. Wade, the landmark ruling that put a spotlight on a woman's right to privacy, grounded in the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. It didn't just recognise privacy. It also struck down Texas's law that banned abortion except to save a woman's life, changing the legal landscape forever. In 1992, oh, there's a bug, hello. It's very interested in what I have to say. In 1992, Planned Parenthood v. Casey reaffirmed the Roe decision, but it also introduced the undue burden standard, giving states room to now regulate abortions, as long as those rules don't place substantial obstacles in a woman's path before viability. This ruling reshaped the battlefield for reproductive rights. Then came the 2022 Dobbs v. Jackson decision, a seismic shift that overturned both Roe and Casey, declaring that abortion is not a constitutional right. It ripped away the privacy protections Roe had established and stripped bodily autonomy from individuals and handing the power back to state governments to decide who gets control over their bodies. This ruling didn't just change laws, it rewrote the rules of freedom in America, unleashing a wave of restrictive bans and legal battles that continue to reshape lives and communities nationwide. The Dobbs decision hammered home that for a right to be constitutional, it has to be, quote, deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. And honestly, that phrase is saying the quiet part out loud. Because when you dig into America's so-called deep roots, bodily autonomy has never been the default for most people. The story the Supreme Court tells us is clear. Control over our bodies belongs to a select few. Because when we rely on systems of power to grant us rights, all we get is the illusion of freedom, rights that are always restricted, conditional, and never fully ours. Now, to understand this a little better, we need to dive into the history of abortion regulation in the US. It began back in the early 1800s. Connecticut was the first state to impose restrictions in 1821. But before that, abortion, maternal care, and reproductive health weren't controlled by the medical establishment. They were led by women. Skilled midwives, many of them enslaved black women, were the experts, quietly running this vital work outside the mainstream system. In 1847, doctors united to form the American Medical Association, the AMA, quickly becoming a white, male-dominated gatekeeper of medical authority. They targeted reproductive health workers, midwives, and nurses, pushing their services out and erasing generations of women-led care. As they consolidated power, AMA members arrogantly claimed the right to decide when abortions could be legal, despite many of them lacking real expertise in pregnancy or reproductive health. Because this wasn't about care, it was about control. According to a historical timeline by the University of San Francisco, the AMA launched a full-scale criminalization campaign targeting abortion and female providers, many of them black women. Now, this is where abortion restrictions and racial injustice become inseparable. Seeing reproductive health care as big business, the AMA pushed criminalization to protect their profits, rallying political allies and leaning on patriarchal powers in families, marriages, and dominant religious institutions. This campaign sparked a century of brutal criminalization. By 1910, abortion was illegal at every stage nationwide, with only rare exceptions to save a woman's life. But even as the law tightened, abortion rights activists were already mobilizing. This era planted the seeds of second-wave feminism and the mainstream reproductive rights movement. Notably, some of these early activists were religious leaders, which I'll dive into later. By 1973, abortion was legal in just 17 states, including New York. Then came Roe v. Wade, ending decades of criminalization. But criminalization never truly disappeared. Less than 50 years later, when Roe fell, 13 states reverted back to their 1800s-style abortion bans, which are now referred to as trigger laws, throwing us right back to a dark era. But many feminist activists and reproductive rights organizations were already sounding the warning bell in the years leading up to Dobbs and rallying state support for abortion rights, fully aware that Roe's downfall was looming on the horizon. And actually, New York stands out as a powerful example. In 2019, the Reproductive Health Care Act was passed thanks to the tireless efforts of organizations like the National Institutes for Public Health, Planned Parenthood, Center for Reproductive Rights, and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. It was a bold new law that frankly felt revolutionary considering the current landscape. What it did was shift abortion law out of the criminal law into public health law, stripping away the threat of criminal prosecution for anyone seeking or providing care. It expanded access beyond 24 weeks and guaranteed legal protections no matter what happened to Roe. Since then, 18 states and Washington, D.C. have followed suit with what are now referred to as shield laws. But not all of those states have fully decriminalized abortion yet. So why is decriminalizing abortion important as opposed to just making it legal up to a certain point? To illustrate this, I want to look a little deeper at the way abortion intersects with racial justice. The threat of criminal prosecution hits marginalized communities the hardest. When it comes to the struggle for women of color to take control of their bodily autonomy, there have always been numerous additional barriers. Second-wave feminism and mainstream reproductive rights have often been critiqued as movements that have not included the voices of Black and brown women or represented their lived realities, instead mostly centering white women leaders. Instead of fighting for a seat at the table, Black women decided to create their own pathway toward liberation, one that centered the needs of their communities. Born in June 1994 at a conference in Chicago, the reproductive justice movement was founded and led by Black women who saw the limits of mainstream reproductive rights, especially when it came to women of color. It fused together reproductive rights and social justice, spotlighting how interconnected inequalities shape our health and autonomy. At its core, reproductive justice champions 3 fundamental rights for all women: to have children, to not have children, and to raise those children in safe and healthy environments. For Black, brown, immigrant, and Indigenous communities, the threat of criminalization has been a constant shadow. Bodily autonomy has always been fragile, if not outright denied. From the targeting of enslaved Black women midwives to modern-day policing of pregnant people of color, generations have faced this harsh reality. Because of this lived experience with the criminal justice system, mainstream abortion rights groups today are increasingly recognizing that centering the voices and expertise of women of color isn't just important, it is now essential. The sharp critiques of the traditional pro-choice framework reveal just how limited and exclusionary it has been for some people. In 2022, after the Dobbs decision dropped, Sister Song executive director Monica Simpson wrote in the New York Times, "To be pro-choice, you must have the privilege of choice." Today, that privilege is gone for countless women under state bans, bringing the realities of Black and white women colliding together. Because without Roe's protections, white middle-class women, many who never thought they would be caught in this fight, are now feeling the impact. Not just those seeking abortions, but those facing miscarriages or obstetric emergencies, denied urgent care because of restrictive laws. And when access depends on your zip code or bank account, the economic divide becomes painfully clear. Traveling out of state, missing work, leaving family behind, and paying thousands of dollars just to get medical care. In 2024, the nonprofit Pregnancy Justice released a report titled "Pregnancy as a Crime," exposing just how far the post-Dobbs crackdown has gone. In just 1 year, at least 210 pregnant people were criminally charged for actions related to their pregnancy, abortion, pregnancy loss, or birth, the highest number ever recorded in a single year. Most were low income, and many were women of color, but a growing number of white women are now being swept into this system too. The message is clear. No one is safe from the widening net of reproductive criminalization. because this isn't a distant issue happening to other communities in far-off places anymore. The threat is here. So let's look at how abortion restrictions are impacting everyday women. And this is where the power of storytelling can take us beyond the theory or statistics and hopefully toward greater empathy by grounding us in potential to see ourselves and the people that we love reflected in the lives of people who are just like us. In early 2024, I released a short documentary called Someone You Know, which featured the stories of 3 women who needed to get an abortion later in their pregnancies: a white Midwestern woman, a black woman from the South, and a Latina immigrant student from Honduras who moved to Florida. Told through animation and real interview footage, these women's experiences illustrated how, even before the Dobbs decision, abortion was already difficult to obtain for many, and those who needed it later in pregnancy had to navigate a hostile landscape with numerous barriers to access, thanks to decades of misinformation and fear-mongering about why people need later abortions, which have led to burdensome restrictions that are not grounded in medically accurate information. Mindy Swank, the Midwestern white woman, had already passed her first trimester when she learned her baby's heart and brain were not formed properly. With this difficult diagnosis, the first doctor she saw more than 10 throughout her whole ordeal, the doctor recommended termination. But in the Iowa area where she lived, most of the hospitals were Catholic institutions, which own 1 in 6 hospital beds across the US and routinely deny reproductive healthcare services to patients. She started to miscarry late in her 2nd trimester and went to one of the hospitals thinking that surely because of all the blood loss and the earlier diagnosis about her baby, she was the exception. But when she arrived, the doctors said, "Yes, we can see blood, but there's not enough blood." She was not bleeding enough for them to justify an abortion to save her life. Because of the lack of medical care, she was forced to give birth to the baby, watching it struggle and grasp for breath until it died in her arms 3 hours and 18 minutes later. At the time, Mindy did not have the means to travel out of state, where she could have gotten the termination she needed much earlier. Hers is not an isolated incident, but she was lucky that she survived, despite suffering immense trauma and then being diagnosed with PTSD. There's no way a law can fully encompass all the things that can go wrong in a pregnancy, she says in the film, underscoring the limitations of even Roe v. Wade. And now, with Roe gone, needing an abortion to save your life is entirely dependent on having the money to travel to a state with a shield law. This means those disparities I mentioned earlier about race are becoming even more visible. You may have heard the stories about Kate Cox and Amanda Zarowski, 2 white women from Texas who needed emergency abortions in 2023, who technically met the state's narrow exceptions, yet they were still denied care. As the clock was ticking, both women had the resources to leave the state, and both have become outspoken advocates for abortion rights today. Kate spoke at the 2024 DNC and is now pregnant again. Amanda's trial became the focus of an award-winning documentary produced by Hillary Clinton and actress Jennifer Lawrence. But there are other stories that are equally important to share. In 2022, Jennifer Alvarez Estrada Glick, a young, pregnant Latina mother also from Texas, was denied life-saving abortion care despite severe medical complications. She too had a case that should have met the state's narrow exceptions. Excuse me. Her months-long ordeal ended in tragedy. She died. A low-income woman without health care insurance, Jennifer was never told at any point that an abortion could have saved her life. As the New Yorker reported, it wasn't just medical failure, it was Texas's abortion ban that cost her her life. In February 2025, Adriana Smith, a black woman from Georgia who was early in her pregnancy, suffered a medical emergency and was declared brain dead. Her family, devastated and seeking closure, requested she be taken off life support, but the state said no. Because of Georgia's extreme abortion ban, Adriana's body was no longer hers or her family's. It became property of the state. Even in death, her autonomy was denied. Why? Because she was pregnant. And as long as a fetal heartbeat was detected, the state refused to let her go. Adriana was kept on life support for months after being declared brain dead. And when the fetus reached viability, doctors performed a C-section without her or her family's consent. The story went viral, sparking outrage and urgent ethical debates, as it should. But one truth cut through it all. When the state controls pregnancy, it controls our bodies. These stories make one thing brutally clear. In a nation hostile to bodily autonomy, economics don't just reflect racial injustice, they enforce it. Economics have become the sharpest dividing line between who gets care and who gets left behind. When an abortion ban is enacted by legislators under the guise of saving life, we have to ask ourselves, whose life are we saving and at what cost? Now, while we're only beginning to face the full impact of abortion bans in the United States, there are other countries we can look to for a blueprint for rebuilding. In Latin America, a powerful reproductive justice movement is rewriting the rules. In a region that is under heavy influence from the Catholic Church, has a long history of dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, civil war, and major social and political upheaval, feminist activists there are reclaiming control over their bodies, winning major legal victories, and proving that change is possible. They're not just resisting, they're leading, and they're inviting us to follow. I'm going to share some stories from a bilingual podcast and video series I created, executive produced, and co-hosted in the fall of 2024 called Green Tide Rising, which you can find on any podcast platform, and I have some bookmarks to give out after as well. Across 8 episodes, Green Tide Rising showcases Latin America's unstoppable green wave, a feminist abortion rights movement that erupted in Argentina in 2018 and has surged through the region, stopping just short of the US-Mexico border. This iconic movement is responsible for a handful of countries now being home to some of the most progressive abortion laws in the world. In 2020, Argentina became the first country to legalize abortion, and it was a historic win that lit the match. In 2021, Mexico's Supreme Court made a landmark decision to decriminalize abortion at the federal level, declaring that criminalizing abortion is unconstitutional and violates women's rights. Can you imagine? Now, this ruling meant that federal authorities could no longer prosecute individuals for seeking or providing abortion services. The decision also mandated that all federal health facilities must provide abortion care. Again, can you imagine? But across the border to the north that same year, Texas passed its infamous SB 8 law, known as the Heartbeat Act. I have to use inverted commas there. Banning abortions after a fetal heartbeat is detected. This is the law that impacted Kate Cox, Amanda Zarowski, and Jennifer Alvarez, who I mentioned earlier. In 2022, Colombia was the next country to push the momentum of the green wave even further, liberalizing their own laws the very same year the US overturned Roe v. Wade. Because of this momentum over the past 5 years in the region, this year, Chile's president has proposed a new abortion law that would decriminalize abortion and make the procedure allowable up to 14 weeks under any circumstance, putting the country on par with Argentina. Let's wait and see what happens. What we wanted to show in this podcast series is that Latin America is rewriting the playbook for winning reproductive rights under hostile governments. It's not about waiting on the courts, Congress, or a single leader. It's a decentralized grassroots movement powered by everyday people, just like you and me. It's not a top-down approach. The power dynamic starts at the local grassroots community level and grows from there. They aren't waiting for heroes. They are the heroes of their own stories. Now, we also aimed to challenge the myth of American exceptionalism and question whether we still deserve to call ourselves a global human rights leader. If the global north can't hold that mantle, maybe it's time to flip the script. Look to the global south for fresh ideas, bold strategies, and a new narrative. Because what we have done in the past no longer serves us today. So how do we secure abortion rights so that they can't be taken away? How do we make our wins so undeniable that it doesn't matter who occupies the White House or who sits on the Supreme Court bench? Throughout Green Tide Rising, our lead expert is a woman named Ximena Casas Izaza, a feminist lawyer and researcher from Colombia with 2 decades of human rights experience at organizations like Planned Parenthood Global and Human Rights Watch. It was her latest groundbreaking research project tracking abortion criminalization across Latin America and the Caribbean that actually inspired the podcast. Her research is the first of its kind, covering 10 different countries with varying abortion laws and restrictions. We dive deep into her analysis of Colombia in episode 4, which not only legalized abortion up to 24 weeks, but also fully decriminalized it, setting a powerful example for the rest of the region. As Ximena and I were shaping this project in early 2022, the Dobbs decision ruling leaked, and we were stunned. Because for decades, Roe v. Wade was considered the gold standard that many Latin American lawyers looked up to, a model that they aimed to emulate. Suddenly that foundation was cracking beneath us, and it gave our project a new narrative focus and a new urgency. In Colombia, the fight to liberalize abortion laws began back in 2005. That year, lawyers from the organization Women's Link Worldwide were on a mission to challenge the country's total abortion ban by pushing for legalization under 3 exceptions: rape, incest, or when the life or health of the pregnant person was at risk. But to make their case, they needed a story that would shake the system. That story came in the form of a woman named Martha Gonzalez. Martha was pregnant with her 4th child when she received a devastating diagnosis: cervical cancer. She pleaded with her doctor to terminate the pregnancy so she could begin chemotherapy. But abortion was still illegal, and her doctor was too afraid to act. Martha was denied the care that could have saved her life. She gave birth to her daughter, but by then the cancer had spread. The Constitutional Court's ruling in 2006 did finally legalize abortion under those 3 exceptional circumstances. But for Martha, the ruling came too late. She died in 2007. Her story, though, became the catalyst for change. Martha's case became a rallying cry, a powerful symbol that echoed across Colombia and fueled a growing movement determined to go beyond the narrow limits of those 3 exceptions. Activists launched Causa Justa, which means just cause, a bold and relentless campaign that stretched over a decade. By 2018, when the Green Wave officially began in Argentina, their efforts had merged with the momentum of the larger movement sweeping across Latin America. When the Dobbs decision came out in 2022, feminist leaders in Colombia braced for backlash, fearing that their own courts might follow the US rollback. But the opposite happened. the Colombian court expanded abortion rights instead of restricting them. Inspired by the Green Wave and grounded in a very different framework, they charted their own course and made history. What my co-host and I discovered about the Causa Justa ruling was eye-opening. Unlike Roe v. Wade, it wasn't just about privacy or the legal right to abortion. It was a sweeping human rights case. The lawsuit argued that Colombia's abortion restrictions were unconstitutional because they violated a woman's right to safe voluntary abortion care, endangered her health, forced religious beliefs onto those that didn't share them, and deepened inequality, especially for migrants, trafficking survivors, and victims of sexual violence. One of the most powerful aspects of the Causa Justa law was its push for full decriminalization. One of the lawyers who worked on the case, Mariana Ardia, who we interviewed, explained to us how they argued that criminalizing abortion not only failed to protect women's health, it put healthcare workers at legal risk and didn't actually prevent abortions. Instead, they showed that decriminalization could reduce both unsafe abortions and maternal deaths. As our expert Jimena Casas described it on our podcast, criminal law is an inadequate tool to regulate a healthcare procedure. I'm going to say that again. Criminal law is an inadequate tool to regulate a healthcare procedure. Someone tell the Supreme Court. Now, this model of decriminalization, now seen in Colombia, Canada, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, South Korea, parts of Australia, and right here in New York, has been endorsed by the World Health Organization for its proven benefits: safer, more accessible abortions, better maternal and infant health, improved economic mobility for women, and stronger outcomes for families. But these outcomes only happen when a government's goal is to ensure everyone has bodily autonomy, and that isn't always the case. A number of Latin American countries still have total abortion bans, like El Salvador and the Dominican Republic, creating a bit of a patchwork landscape, much like we have in the States across the country here, where you are either imprisoned for an obstetric emergency, like a woman named Teodora Vasquez in El Salvador, or you die because you were denied life-saving abortion care despite medical complications, like a young woman named Esperancita from the Dominican Republic, both women whose stories we highlighted in Green Tide Rising. But the Green Wave is committed to the ongoing fight, actively pushing for change across the region. And these leaders recognize that the push for legal decriminalization must start with the social decriminalization of abortion. Change the culture first, and the courts and the Congress will follow. In Green Tide Rising, Jimena Casas breaks down the idea of what social decriminalization is, reminding us that a legal win, while vitally important, cannot be the only goal. True change comes when society shifts its mindset. So the Green Wave strategy follows a four-part approach. Number one, to use a human rights framework to reform laws. 2, expose that bans do not stop abortions. 3, back it up with the data. And number 4, mobilize grassroots movements. That final step, the grassroots power, is where social decriminalization begins. So what does social decriminalization actually look like? It's not just policy, it's culture, it's community, and it's everyday action. It's the conversations at your kitchen table. It's the bold posts you share on social media. It's the sea of green bandanas and signposts held in the street, marching in solidarity for a common cause. It's TV shows and films portraying abortion with honesty, not shame or stigma. It's student unions hosting real, respectful debates. It's a singer using their stage to speak truth between songs. It's neighbourhood moms rallying around a young woman who needs care fast. It's that one brave voice pushing back against misinformation at the family holiday dinner. Who can relate? It's a corporate leader making sure abortion care is covered in employee benefits. And it's faith leaders standing up for bodily autonomy because they are often the first people someone turns to in a moment of crisis. Religious leaders and faith-based groups have played a powerful role in the rise of the Green Wave across Latin America. In Green Tide Rising, we highlighted two voices from Católicas por el Derecho a Decidir, Catholics for the Right to Decide. In episode 1, we meet Marta Alanes, the founder of Católicas in Argentina and the visionary behind the green bandana. Maybe you've seen this symbol. Marta chose green intentionally. It stands for nature, growth, birth, and life. But it was also a bold act of reclamation, taking language, life, and symbols often used by the anti-abortion movement and turning them into a banner for freedom and dignity. In episode 8, we speak with Maria Consuelo Mejia, a devout Catholic and founder of Católicas in Mexico. She powerfully challenged the harmful idea, that God condemns those who have abortions. For her, faith and justice go hand in hand. Maria uplifts the voice of church leaders who preach compassion, not punishment, and who believe that God has given each of us the divine right and freedom of conscience to make our own choices. She says, God is not a scary man in a cloud with a big stick waiting to hit you over the head. I kind of love that analogy. Reminds me of being a kid. As she told us, true faith means standing up for your rights and fighting for the dignity to decide. In the United States, the loudest religious voices on abortion have long come from religious conservatives. For decades, they've dominated the narrative, partly because too many pro-choice voices have stayed silent, even avoiding using the word abortion. But silence has consequences. When we don't push back on misinformation, it spreads. Now, healthy debate is one thing, an important thing. But when powerful conservative religious leaders back a president solely for his promise to overturn Roe v. Wade, despite his record of harming the very people faith is meant to protect, it's clear that this was never about protecting life. And this is the moment that calls for good trouble and some good old-fashioned social justice rebellion. Anti-choice religious conservatives may be the loudest today, but they are not the majority. Pew Research shows that 6 in 10 Catholics support abortion rights. And aside from evangelical Protestants, most major religious groups agree abortion should be legal in most or all cases. And similar to what we see in Latin America, perhaps people of faith can be the voices we need to lead the fight for social decriminalization in the US, like they did in the 60s and 70s. History gives us some bold, badass examples of faith leaders who defied the law to help women access abortion. Their moral compass led them to stand up for dignity, compassion, and justice. Long before the moral majority rallied behind Reagan in the 70s to overturn Roe v. Wade, a very different faith-led movement was quietly saving lives. In 1967, a group of 21 Protestant ministers and Jewish rabbis in New York City formed the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion, an underground network that counseled women and referred them to vetted, licensed doctors for safe abortions. At the helm was Reverend Howard Moody of Judson Memorial Church, a radical activist who was decades ahead of his time. The movement spread across 38 states, growing to 3,000 clergy members. And by the time Roe was decided in 1973, the CCS had helped an estimated 450,000 women access safe abortions before it was legal. They weren't breaking the law in spite of their faith. They were doing so because of it. In a book about the history of the CCS titled To Offer Compassion, authors Doris Andrea Dirks and Patricia Ralph uncover powerful archival insights about Reverend Moody. His mission was for the church to show up wherever pain, injustice, or inequality existed, and to never play it safe. Even before the CCS, in the 50s and 60s, Moody accompanied women seeking abortions and witnessed the trauma firsthand, calling some of the experiences frightening. At the time, unsafe abortions claimed up to 5,000 lives per year. Alongside other faith leaders committed to justice, Reverend Moody and his peers vowed to help women with what they called problem pregnancies, even if it meant civil disobedience. Using their privileged and trusted role in society, they quietly assisted women while hoping for legislative change in New York. But after repeated failures in Congress, they were fed up waiting on the proverbial political hero of the story to save the day. They formed the CCS, set strict safety protocols, and went public, landing a front-page story on the New York Times. Unafraid of exposure, they refused to hide behind euphemisms, insisting on using the word abortion to break the silence. While they continued to push for legal reform, they were driven by a deeper call, a moral and religious duty to help women no matter the law. They showed up in the lives of people as representatives of God's love, affirming that the right to abortion was sacred. The CCS didn't wait for permission from lawmakers. They took bold action. I have deep admiration for the leaders of the CCS, especially because their legacy lives on in the work that I am personally connected to. Outside of my filmmaking, I currently serve as board chair of the Religious Community for Reproductive Choice, a national nonprofit that has been advocating for abortion access for over 50 years. Its roots, they trace directly back to the CCS. Today, our mission is more urgent than ever, and like the CCS before us, we recognise that it may once again fall to courageous leaders of faith to step up, speak out, and protect our right to choose. One of the powerful traditions our organisation leads is called a clinic blessing, bringing local faith leaders together to bless abortion clinics, usually independent abortion clinics across the country, as well as their staff, patients, and communities. Last October, I attended one of these clinic blessings at the Women's Health Centre on the West Virginia-Maryland border, a place where one state has a total abortion ban and the other has protected it. At this event, we met Reverend Jim Lewis, an original CCS member. Now in his mid-80s and quite frail, Reverend Lewis's words were anything but weak. With the presidential election looming, he delivered a sharp warning. "Make America great again?" he asked rhetorically. More like, "Make America gruesome again." His voice carried the weight of history and a clear warning of what we are going to see more of if we don't take action. So what does real action look like? From where I stand, we can learn a lot from the leaders of Latin America's Green Wave. Winning reproductive freedom under hostile governments is not a solo mission. It's never just one lawyer, one politician, or one leader. Jimena Casas told us that the Green Wave's strength is derived from its many shades of green, where everyone has a part to play in the fight for bodily autonomy and collective liberation. I love that picture that she paints. History shows us that when we refuse to accept the status quo, the most unexpected heroes rise up. A few years ago, I interviewed former Planned Parenthood CEO Gloria Felt, who now heads up a women's leadership organisation called Take the Lead. I asked her what lessons we can learn today from past setbacks, given her wealth of experience and body of work with the organisation in the 90s. Her advice is to stop fighting back and constantly playing defence. Instead, learn how to fight forward. In other words, what would it look like if we set the agenda and established the narrative about abortion rights today? For me, filmmaking and storytelling are my form of activism. Stories have the power to spark conversation and open minds. I know this firsthand because first-person stories are what helped me shift my own views on abortion when I was still part of the conservative evangelical church that I grew up in. In that world, my body was never my own. It belonged to God, and more importantly, to my father or my husband. Terms like bodily autonomy or freedom of choice, they didn't exist. I heard too many stories of women trapped in abusive marriages, told to stay because divorce meant reclaiming control over their own lives. From the pulpit, and always from men, I heard abortion called a sin, a vote to be cast against. Those sermons were powerful political weapons. Yet behind the closed doors, I saw a very different truth. Women who publicly claimed to be pro-life secretly getting abortions. One even said that God would forgive her abortion while she voted to deny other women that same right. That contradiction, those hidden stories, reveal the complexity and humanity behind the issue. This confusing juxtaposition was the start of my journey to educate myself about abortion. Journalism, documentaries, films, and storytelling became my primary means of hearing stories and becoming familiar with the data. So years later, learning about the history of religious leaders who championed abortion and now being on the board of an interfaith nonprofit that is continuing this legacy has given me a newfound respect for the role of religion in the resistance. So instead of asking who controls our bodies, let's flip the script. Ask yourself, how can I change the narrative? Look around at the people sitting next to you. Think about the people in your own life and the communities that you're part of. How can you show up as a leader and advocate for reproductive freedom if this is a fight that you care about as much as I do? Teodora Vasquez, the woman from El Salvador I mentioned, was imprisoned for 11 years for an obstetric emergency. 11 years, can you imagine? Upon her release, she was offered amnesty by a number of countries so she could finally live in safety with her family. But she chose to stay in El Salvador, saying, "This is my country." She started a mutual aid, community-based organization advocating for abortion law reforms, offering a place for women to come and rebuild their lives after they were imprisoned, and educating other women to know their rights so they don't end up like her. She isn't wealthy nor powerful, but taking a single step forward for change is now having a ripple effect in the lives of many women. After hearing stories about the everyday brave activists in the Green Wave and the bold religious leaders in the clergy consultation service, if today is the day that you join the resistance, what would your rebellion, your good trouble, look like? How can you partake in socially decriminalising abortion in your life and community? Perhaps, like me, it starts with turning inward and interrogating our own stigma and complex attitudes about the issue. It's a good place to start. I want to end with a quote from civil rights activist, poet, and feminist Audre Lorde that often grounds me in the work that I do and helping me remember my why. "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own." Thank you. And before we do the Q&A, I kind of want to do something really cool, which Melissa said I could.